So welcome everybody to this week's webinar. I'm Emma Maslen, I'm the CEO of inspir'em. I did think that I've got a bit of a habit of always wearing this jumper on a Friday. I will promise to change my dress next time so that you guys don't think that I'm an avatar, for sure. I have got a slightly different background today. But very much welcome to the webinar. It's the second webinar in our series on pipeline generation. It's to accompany our pipeline generation course that we've got online, which all of you have access to. We're running some slightly different content to what's actually available in the course because we're trying to show a couple of different lenses on pipeline generation. Whilst for most of you, it will be the start of your new financial year and you'll be thinking about pipeline generation and making sure that those new territories, you're thinking about your plans and you're generating pipeline for the year. For some of you, the year is in full swing and you're thinking about how do you get pipeline for next year or start to think about your planning. So I'll talk in a second a little bit about today's webinar, but as I've mentioned, feel free to put something in the chat where you're dialing in from today. Hope everybody's safe given the crazy weather across the globe. And you will also have an opportunity to put a question in the chat, in the Q&A as well. So feel free to do that. So I'm just going to get up some slides for today. The session that we'll run is we're going to run about 15 minutes on some slides. And then I've got some questions from different people and also feel free to add to those questions. So today we're going to be talking about pipeline generation planning and specifically personal goals within that. So as I mentioned, this is the second part of the series that we're running, which we're running until Easter. And today we're going to be talking about personal goals, why that's important for pipeline generation planning, and then how do you build that into your plan and keep yourself motivated to do the hard yards throughout the year. Just a quick plug for the next webinar that we'll be running. So in 2 weeks' time on the 7th of February, David Mayer, who's the MD of Clarify B2B, he'll be joining us to talk about ideal customer profiles. For those of you who aren't familiar with Clarify and David, their business is responsible for driving enterprise leads, and they typically drive them from account-based planning, territory planning, all the way through to demo. So if you imagine that their team is a team of sort of crack SDRs that are SDRing for a living, their career SDRs. So it's all about target markets, correct ICPs, making sure that they can be really efficient in that lead generation space. David and his team have done some amazing work around really honing in on ICPs for their customers, those ideal customer profiles. And I thought it'd be great to get him to share some of those insights. So he'll be on with us in 2 weeks. A quick plug about what you'll have after this is don't forget you'll have access to the resources, and we'll put this webinar on the recordings part of the course as well. And you will also see that you've now got a new course, which is in your library, which is the Pipeline Generation Planning course that appeared 2 weeks ago. Over the next few weeks, we will release more of that course content. So you'll hear a little bit more about some of the things that we're talking about. You see some of the same slides and some different ideas and spins on generating your pipeline reconciliation plan and thinking about your territory for the year. So the pipeline generation course that we have that is available to you online talks through these subjects. And today we're really going to focus in on those personal and business goals and how do we keep ourselves motivated and thinking about the leading indicators to keep all of that activity going throughout the year. So let's just think about our personal goals first of all. So we talked to this slide last time that we got together. Really our goals are based on the funnel that we're going to generate. So everything really starts with thinking about that target market and that ICP at the very top. Funnels and conversion are usually things that are fairly set in stone. We can do things to help with efficiency of the funnel. But essentially, the more effort you put in the top in terms of pipeline generation, the more you'll close. And frankly, if you're looking to achieve something that's correlated back to your closing motion, ultimately you're going to achieve your goals. So it's really important that we think about actually how does closing affect us personally, and what's the type of achievement that we need to achieve, and therefore what's the conversion back from that. So what we're going to talk to today is how do we think about those goals and how do we think about the conversion as well. If anybody does have any questions as we go through, feel free to put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A. Okay. Our goals are very much the beginning part of that pipeline generation planning. It's essentially the what that we want to achieve. It is the big picture, but it's also the why, because pipeline generation planning and pipeline execution is something that is a task that is week in, week out. It has to be done meticulously, and we have to make sure that it's a consistent activity throughout the year. When we think about territory planning and that ideal customer profile that we mentioned, that's really going to be the who. And we'll talk to that a little bit today about how you make sure you think about the who and maximizing your territory so ultimately you can get back to those goals. Some of these other subjects we'll talk about a little bit later on within the series. So if we think about our personal goals and why this is all linked together, I'm just going to walk you through sort of how the maths works out. So I've got some nominal numbers in here to have a think about. So if we want you to earn £100,000, perhaps that's in commission, whatever your numbers are, we have a requirement to do that because that's for our goals. Our earnings are very much tied to the pipeline that we generate and the opportunity that we close. And our goal achievement is very much tied to that too. Now, maybe you don't have a earning goal. Maybe it's something else. Maybe you want to buy a new house or you want to buy a new car. Ultimately, that's going to be tied to earnings. Or maybe actually it's about achievement because you want to get promoted and you want to go and do something else within your career. Well, that's the second part of this because earnings is very much part of it, personal achievement, getting the things that you want to do, but also attainment is part of that as well because our organizations require us to get to attainment because they want us to be successful. They want the company to be successful as well. So two things that we need to be thinking about within our personal goals, which is what do we want to achieve personally, but also what's the company expecting of us? The next part of the puzzle in terms of the equation is about the conversion. So we need to understand what our conversion rates are to be able to really work through the maths of what pipeline we need to achieve that very first column. Now, conversion rates will be very different for any organization, and typically conversion rates are somewhere for enterprise between 11 and 17% from lead inception to close. And that's not that you would lose all of the other opportunity. You have a big portion of that that goes to close not won, because there's always opportunity that goes stale. But that's typically the sort of conversion that most enterprise organizations are working to. Now, your conversion will change depending on product type, depending on the type of account you're selling into, but also it will depend on if they're existing customers or new customers. So it's worth you understanding your different types of conversion to be able to then calculate the pipeline that's needed. Now, in this particular case, I've made the maths easy because otherwise it's very difficult for me to talk to this point. So we're going to say for now, for purposes of this, that conversion's 20%. Therefore, we're going to need, for us to get to the closing 500K ARR, we would need a pipeline of 2.5 million. Now, the reason why I mention this is because this is going to be the very heart of any pipeline reconciliation plan that we do. And absolutely, then the activity that we're driving week over week should be linked back to this particular goal. So all of the other elements of this, our territory planning, how we're thinking about our target market, we're thinking back to these goals. Because if we can't understand, well, actually, what the deal size is, how many deals do we need to be able to achieve these numbers, then actually it just becomes a plan for plan's sake. We're not really making a plan to convert pipeline and ultimately achieve those goals. So conversion is very important to understand. We need to understand what that pipeline coverage is that we need. Now, one thing that I would mention around this, though, is there is a bit of a pipeline and coverage conundrum. Typically, what tends to happen in most organizations is you land the year, you get a new territory, and you think, oh, I haven't got the sort of pipeline coverage that I need. Most organizations stipulate that over 4 rolling quarters, you're going to need about 3 to 3.5 times your quota coverage for pipeline. So we start the year, we start a new territory, and we have a massive spike of activity. There is a bit of a challenge with doing that, though, and that is because what spikes with pipeline activity is that customer activity spikes with that as well. Now, we are a little bit blessed in Q1. It might not feel like that at this current point, but you are blessed in the fact that Q1 is probably the only full quarter really that we get. It doesn't feel like that, but it probably is. When you think about Easter, holidays falling in April, summer holidays, and then Thanksgiving and the Christmas period, actually you get a fuller Q1 than you get in any other time of the year. The challenge, though, is when we spike all of this activity really early in the year, what can happen is that we have a lot of pipeline that potentially goes stale. I know this is something from a RevOps perspective. Every RevOps person that I've ever had goes a little crazy about because there's this big activity, this big spike. Doesn't our pipeline look amazing? But we actually can't service that opportunity. So by the time we get into Q3, Q2, Q3, we're closing out some of that opportunity because, frankly, we haven't been able to follow that up. And another way to be thinking about this is if you think about what happens over the quarters, every quarter you start with a different pipeline number, you close out some opportunity, whether that's won or close lost, you'll create some new pipeline, and then you will end the quarter with a different pipeline number. And this goes on sort of throughout the year. And your pipeline will very much vary throughout the year. So whilst we have these sort of fixed views of 3 times coverage, 3.5 times coverage, the reality is you're going to ebb and flow throughout the year. So your total pipeline number will need to be larger than the coverage number itself, because over a 4 rolling quarters, you will need to be backfilling the pipeline that you're closing out. So really where we need to get to is we need to have a slightly more normalized set of activity around pipeline. And essentially that's pipeline creation and then the follow-up and the progression, because it stands us in a much better stead of being quarterly performant, essentially, and making sure that we're achieving the numbers that we need to achieve towards the end of the year. It also takes the pressure off us as well, whilst it may not feel like that's the case, particularly in Q4 when we don't want to be generating too much pipeline. It absolutely will take the pressure off us, because what we're then doing is we're generating pipeline that will then flow into the following year. So really important when you're thinking about coverage, be thinking about those waves throughout the quarters, servicing those opportunities and making sure that you're leaving enough in the bank to be able to then go and generate some opportunity at the end of the year. So a couple of other points just to mention then. So some top tips to start with, and then I'll just talk about territory planning. If you've got any questions around this, then please feel free to pop them in the chat. So some top tips just around the coverage point. So first of all, we want to make sure that we're maximizing our territory, and I'm going to talk to that point again in a bit more detail in a second. But ensure that when we're thinking about the pipeline plan at the beginning of the year or at any point in the year, we're thinking about where we're going to go and how do we continue to be consistent with generating pipeline. Are we maximizing all of the opportunity that there is? Do we understand where we could go first for the fastest opportunity? The second point is to make sure that you're being consistent. Make sure that you're building the time into your working week. Make sure that you're consistent with the way that you're generating pipeline and you're spending the same amount of time. If you've ever thought about the maths of pipeline generation, the reality is in most quarters, you're only going to generate pipeline in 9 weeks out of 12, because usually the first week of any quarter is scooped up with QBRs. The last week of the quarter is usually chaos, and you'll have some sort of holiday during the quarter as well. It's important to mention this because if you think about actual pipeline generation days, you need to factor that in to not put yourself under too much pressure to do too much, because we need to be realistic about our time. And the third point here is about planning for capacity. Because the thing is not all deals are equal. So we're going to be generating some opportunity and then we'll be maturing that pipeline over time. But big deals don't behave that way. So we'll do a lot of activity in the beginning of the year. We'll probably be progressing that throughout the year. But a lot of the maturity and the progression actually happens at the back end of the year as well. So when you're thinking about your waves and the likelihood of you generating opportunity, be thinking about those big deals that you want to win as well. Because that pipeline generation to get to your big deal, particularly if you're trying to put in multiple products into one account, you're going to need to do consistent pipeline generation to be planning for those big deals. So some of the learnings that you'll see in the course that we have, so feel free to go and have a look at that. I'll just talk you through how we sort of put together a PRP. So I've mentioned you'd put your personal goals in the middle, you'd put your conversion rates in the middle, and then essentially what you'd start to do is you'd start to then build that out. We need to be thinking where we're going to go and access our pipeline. We'd think about existing accounts, we'd think about new accounts, and then we'd start to map out those accounts. Maybe there's some breadth in accounts that we're thinking about, some different departments that we might go after. We're also thinking about product sets, about where we would go product wise. But we're also trying to break that out as well and start thinking about the personas and the targets that we would go to. Because essentially on the week on week activity, that's the thing that we're going to measure. So if we've got 10 targets for an IT compliance deal in YouTube, do we know who those people are? Do we know what our message is? Are we going out to those people, and are we cycling through that opportunity? So as we talk about territory planning and pipeline planning over the coming weeks, this is the sort of methodology that we'll go through, where essentially you start to sort of spider diagram out all of the places that you could go, because then you're going to narrow that down and say, well, actually, this is where I am going to go, because I know that existing accounts will drive a faster conversion, most likely, and a better conversion than new accounts. But maybe you've got a net new target too. So you need to be thinking about both, and this is about allocation of time. Okay. And then you can go even deeper. So the idea is these spider diagrams, they get bigger and bigger. It's in a spider diagram because you can't put them in the CRM. These are ideas. They are not opportunities at this point. But we would try and map this out. And again, so you can see some commonality and start thinking about your messaging. Okay. So when you're thinking about those territory plans, some things to consider. So make sure you do some territory analysis, understand your conversion, understand the maths. Make sure you're then prioritizing those accounts so you know where to go first, because whilst you're building out your plan, you do need to execute on the creation. Don't get into analysis paralysis. Let's start prioritizing, executing, test the market, come back. Make sure your account planning activity is in there as well. Your key accounts should be part of your territory plan. They are where you should be spending the majority of your pipeline generation time, because they are your key accounts. But also be thinking about renewals and true ups as well, because they're big, compelling events for customers. So understand when they are, understanding which accounts they are in, because that may be where you're building towards the end of the year. Okay. And then finally, what that then gives you is it gives you then an opportunity to put it into something like a cookbook, which is, okay, I've got 50 targets I want to go after in BT, or 50 targets in JP Morgan. Okay, where do I start? I'm starting here because this is my priority. This is where I think I'm going to get to. So let's make sure that I'm doing that on a weekly basis. Okay. And within the material that we've provided to you as well, there's some suggestions about how you analyze your pipeline. So there's some different ways you can think about analyzing your pipeline, just to make sure that you've got risk mitigation in there and good health of pipeline. So pipeline is maturing the way you expect it to be. It's the shape you expect it to be. And you've got big deals, small deals, medium-sized deals within that pipeline coverage as well. So feel free to go in and have a look at that. But then also hold yourself to some standards, industry standards around creation as well. So creation execution is something that we often forget. We do a lot of planning and researching. We don't like the rejection bit. We need to do that. So once a week, we absolutely need to be driving pipeline execution. I say 9 weeks out of 12, as I've said before, just trying to be realistic about how many weeks of the quarter we're actually in with other commitments that we have. So make sure you are prioritizing that pipeline execution. Make sure you're also thinking about the number of customer meetings you have. The more customer meetings you have, the more opportunity you'll find. Agendaed meetings for sure, but the best way to find pipeline is in existing opportunities. And we would suggest that 8 new business meetings. So that's a 10% plus qualified net new opportunity a quarter. That's a good stat to be from an enterprise perspective. And then also just make sure that you're monitoring how many accounts you're active in and you're pipelining into. We talked to this, and there was a question about this last time, about how many accounts at any one point. We would typically suggest your focus is around 10 accounts and you cycle those through. Don't cycle them through too quickly, work really hard on them, and then take the cycle ones out that you're not getting the sort of traction that you need. So there's some stats that you can sort of work to make sure that you're monitoring your own activity and seeing how you're getting on with the pipeline. Now, we did have a question actually that came in earlier this week, which was around if you are working some really big opportunities and, or perhaps even it's Q4, the creation execution piece, what is our recommendation around that? I would suggest as much as possible to try and spread your pipeline generation throughout the week. So whilst it is 1 day per week, try and do a little bit every day. Because if you are working on big opportunities and there are priorities that come in, you need to be able to move that and still make your commitment to pipeline generation. You can always spend an hour and a half, 2 hours on pipeline generation a day. There's always time to do that. Blocking out a whole day sometimes does make that difficult. So just play with that and just be flexible around that point and build it into your week. So, and this is the sort of recommendation we'd make around do pipe gen early in the morning, eat the ugliest frog as early as you can, because then you know the rest of the day is yours, right? So the earlier the better. The best time that's recommended to reach executives if you're pipelining into executives is 7:30 a.m. in any country. So because they're usually commuting, they're picking up their emails, they're scanning what's going on. So it just gives you an idea of if you do it early, you're probably going to get a better conversion. Okay, so I'll just finish up on the top tips then. As I mentioned, plan to maximize the territory, build out the plan as full as you can, and then use that to then guide your activity throughout the week. Make sure you've got consistency in the when you're doing it, really important. We've got a new checklist that's going to appear actually over the next couple of weeks around territory planning to help you with that consistency. So have a look out for that. It will be in the next newsletter that we send out. And then make sure that you're planning your capacity. So think about if you do too much pipeline generation, making sure that that doesn't go stale. So how do you service that pipeline? And also those big deals as well. So be thinking about how do I build up for the big deals at the end of the year? It might not drive your pipeline number today, but it will do at the end of the year. So it's just balancing the risk reward there for sure. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to open it up to any questions now. So let me just stop sharing. Okay. So we've had a couple of questions come in. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in chat or you can vote up other people's questions as well. So a question that we had, which was selling into mid-range or to large enterprise accounts, how do you expect the deal size breakdown? What percentage allocated to big deals versus percentage of more transactional deals? Actually, in the course that we've got, in the first part that you've got receipt of already, there is actually a pyramid in there, which is a recommended percentages of deals. I would suggest that that's probably going to be about the same percentage in time. It's a simple 2-4-8, which is the way that you'd be looking at that. Certainly with your key accounts, you need to be considering what's the revenue you expect from your key accounts and do the maths back. So whilst we've made some recommendations in there, you're going to have to do the maths based on your own personal deal sizes. Certainly with the bigger accounts, you don't really want it to be more than about 30% of your run rate business, because otherwise you do really stand a risk situation there. So you want to make sure you're just balancing that. But if there's a specific question and you have some of the numbers on that, then feel free to drop me a line, emma@inspir'em.coach. Happy to help out on that specific question. Another question that's come in, which is, what would you advise around sharing pipeline building activity across the team, AEs, pre-sales, partners, etc., and sharing stories about what's working and what's not? Yeah, it's a great question. When I was at SAP, we did some fabulous pipeline generation days and we got everybody involved. So we had typical games, leaderboards, all of those sorts of things. We very much rewarded the extended team more than we rewarded the salespeople, because getting the extended team involved, actually, it's usually a harder task for them because they're not geared up for pipeline generation. But it's important that they do it. Particularly pre-sales people have got amazing relationships with our customers. Often they can find out things that we can't find out. So I would suggest having pipeline generation days involve the teams and partners in that as well. Over my career, I've frequently done pipeline generation days with partners. Again, get them in, order some pizza, make some calls. Really valuable to be able to do that. As part of those days, it's useful to then do a bit of storytelling. So over lunch or early in the morning, inspire some people. Also, if you've got a bell in the office, like ring the bell when somebody gets a decent meeting, right? Let's tell the story of how that meeting's come about. Or maybe you're telling a story from a previous pipeline generation day. We are more likely to retain that information if it's in stories. So if you can do some bell ringing, those types of things. For those of you remote, actually, you can do all of those things remotely. Often, in a couple of organisations I've worked with, we've done a ring the bell remotely and dialed everybody into Zoom. So you can do that, have certain checkpoints throughout the day, get everybody on and do a ring the bell. So, yeah, so just play around with that. Again, if you're looking for ideas, happy to help with that. I've got another question, which is, do we run a discovery course on good discovery questions, how to ask discovery questions and handle objections? Yeah, absolutely. So we do that in line with Medic and MedPick, thinking about the types of questions that you need to ask. And also, we could talk about all of the questions that you could ask, understanding that you're probably only going to get 3 to 5 decent questions in on a call with a customer. So which ones should you really ask? Which ones are the really important questions so that we can make those ones count? So yeah, happy to help with that if you want to drop us an email. Happy to have that discussion, all aligned to identified pain and metrics, because that's where we discover that pain. Okay. No other questions for now. Let me just check the chat that there wasn't any other questions that I had missed. Okay. So if we haven't got any other questions, just a thanks everybody for joining the session today. As I've mentioned, the next one will be in 2 weeks, 7th of February. David Mayer will be joining us and talking about ICPs. If anybody's got any questions following the webinar today, please do come back to us and let us know. Or if you've got questions for any of the material as well, come back again and happy to answer those questions. So I wish you all a very safe weekend with our crazy weather and look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks. Thanks very much.